In Britain and the United States during the second half of the 20th century, the inner city became subject to a process of territorial stigmatization in the media and popular culture, by politicians, even by the people who lived there. Impoverished, derelict and decaying, riddled with crime and shaken by periodic riots. These powerful and inherently racialized narratives help to shape popular understandings of these spaces, especially for those who hardly ever visited or actively avoided them. As such, they tell us so much about the societies which constructed them. But these narratives have also occluded many of the lived realities on the ground. And so in this paper, influenced by theorists including Henri Lefebvre and Edward Soja, I want to explore the relationship between the inner city as a real place and an imagined space. I will briefly look at the material forces which have historically shaped and impacted on these communities, how contemporaries imagined these material changes, often in dialogue with academic sociology, and cultural or political ideas about US urbanism, and how the consequent territorial stigmatization has hidden the much more complex stories of everyday life within the inner city. So though this paper focuses on the inner city in Britain, there are certain similarities with other urban spaces and national contexts. Obviously, the inner city in the United States, but also, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the banlieue in France, or modernist housing projects throughout the world. Similarly, I am focusing on historicizing these developments because, firstly, I'm a historian, and secondly, because, as Doreen Massey and others have clearly argued, time and space are mutually constitutive. Paying close attention to how these spaces and attitudes towards them have developed and changed over time is important, because the discourses which developed in the in the 1960s and 1970s, are still with us today and continue to influence how people imagine the inner city, even as in many places the socioeconomic context has rapidly changed through urban regeneration and gentrification. So first, to think about them as real physical places. 19th century industrialization and urbanization brought with it rapidly but poorly built housing, commonly termed slums, as well as pristine avenues of townhouses. Now, the inner cities were born out of these areas of 19th century housing, which was mostly located adjacent to the city centre. The slums, as they were called, were scheduled for clearance in the mid-20th century, but by the 1960s, they were still awaiting demolition. And so they were providing basic affordable housing. And the townhouses, which in the 19th century were home to a burgeoning middle class, but after their suburbanization, they became increasingly subdivided and rented out to lower income and immigrant families, especially to people of colour, who were affected by informal redlining and discriminatory policies initiated by local councils and new town corporations. The inner city areas in Britain also comprised some council estates, including modernist high and medium rise blocks of flats, which were built in areas cleared of older housing. Now, this is very much a potted history of the inner city as a physical place through the medium of housing. The wider history of their development is obviously much more complex. Their development can also, for example, be seen through other physical infrastructure projects like urban motorways, which often tore through communities to ease the mobility of suburban and peri-urban residents, but physically isolated inner urban neighbourhoods. But I hope this does give us an idea of the kind of areas and environments which came to be defined as the inner city. Now turning to them as imagined spaces. Cultural and political imaginations of the inner city in Britain were influenced by developments in the United States. The term emerged in the US to describe the predominantly black downtown areas of large cities, which had been shaped by processes of white flight and deindustrialization. Following the so-called long hot summer of urban disorder across many US cities in 1967, the term gained further currency as a euphemism for black neighborhoods and the dangers they supposedly posed to white society. The following year, British politician Enoch Powell made his now infamous Rivers of Blood speech, raising the spectre of similar racialized disorder on the other side of the Atlantic. The Labour government responded with an urban programme to direct funding towards the inner cities. The term had firmly entered the British lexicon and was guided by new sociological studies, which identified areas of concentrated multiple deprivation. While areas of, quote, slum housing had long been subject to territorial stigmatization, the importation of this American discourse reshaped contemporary understandings of the inner city. Coming on the heels of the rediscovery of poverty by social scientists, policymakers, and media commentators, the term inner city quickly became associated with concentrated multiple deprivation and large Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities, but particularly immigrant communities. They also fast became sites of danger. The physical markers of dereliction and urban decay brought about by industrial and population decline and housing being scheduled for clearances which never came to fruition, became closely associated with the threat of crime, both real and imagined. And of course, the spectre of racialized disorder continued to hang over the inner city, even before the uprisings of the early 1980s. These discourses were replete throughout media reporting on urban issues. One journalist's account even likened Britain's inner cities to the, quote, third world, which is a very politically charged term, especially at that time. But they were also spread through cultural representations of inner city life. For example, the 1984, I believe, film Letter to Brezhnev, which depicted inner Liverpool as a site of deprivation, unemployment, and petty criminality, which the protagonist Elaine could only escape by falling in love with a Soviet sailor on shore leave and making a new life with him, with the permission of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. And there are many other examples of this. Now, in this very brief talk, I have tried to offer a small glimpse into the physical development of inner urban areas and the way they were understood or imagined by contemporaries. It is impossible to understand one without the other. They are, to use Edward Soja's term, real and imagined spaces. But this also presents us with a problem. If we focus on the physical development of these spaces, as I have here, and the way these changes were understood within cultural and media discourses, we gain a really important insight into the process of territorial stigmatization and how that related to material changes on the ground. And this is an important thing to do. But it also hides the much more complex community and cultural histories and personal experiences of the people that live there. In the case of the inner city, locating these histories will help us to better understand marginalised communities, as well as how territorial stigmatisation shaped their everyday lives and their own sense of place.